Okay. Is it? So we can start. This is the September 10th, 2019 meeting of the Plan and Zoning Commission. Our chairman, Matt Wagner's not here tonight. Our first item, Mike, you're sitting tonight for
yeah,
Matt.
we would have, Mr. DiGiacomo would sit for Mr. Wagner. Mr. Noonan that plans to be here, but he's running a little late, so Mr. Elliott can sit for Mr. Noonan until he arrives.
Okay, great. Our first item is meeting minutes.
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay. Any comments on the meeting, on the minutes? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Steve.
Our next item is to go into a closed executive session. We need a 2/3 vote in order to do that. Could I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
Second? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Opposed? Any abstentions?
We're going to go just to the room down the hall, and we'll ask Attorney Melinda Powell to join us in that.
So we're going into a closed session. We'll be back shortly. So we're back in session. No votes or decisions were made during the executive session. We did, we're considering whether to appeal a case. We need a motion to go ahead.
I move to instruct and authorize the town attorney to file for a writ of certification to the Supreme Court in the matter of Garden Homes Management versus Town Plan and Zoning of the town of Fairfield.
Do I have a second?
A second.
Any discussion? Let's take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so the item passes. The next item on our agenda, new applications for recommendations for public hearing, 60 Round Hill Road.
This item, Mr. Chairman, is the RBC Heim Bearings Company. They've been, it's been an industrial site since the 50s on Round Hill Road.
I don't think your microphone's on.
This is an existing industrial site at 60 Round Hill Road, adjacent to the Realtors Building, if you know where that is. It's a one-story building. They're looking to expand. They were considering actually either relocating out of town, but they've decided to do an addition to their building, which requires a public hearing for the special permit.
Is the hearing required?
It is.
All right. So I need a motion for a public hearing.
Move to public hearing.
Commissioner McAleese, a second. Commissioner Levin?
Second.
Any discussion?
Will the size of the addition conform to our regulations?
Yes.
Coverage and, thank you.
Anyone else? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the item carries. Next item, 3135 Easton Turnpike.
This is the Sacred Heart University West Campus, the former GE property. If you've ever been up there or familiar with the building, the two buildings don't really have a common entrance, and they don't interact well with each other, meaning there's not a great way to get from one building to the other. So they are proposing a connecting entry lobby that would kind of tie the two buildings together with common entry space as you approach the building. So it's a modest addition to the building. It is a special exception, does require a public hearing.
Great. Could I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Meg and Steve. Any discussion? We ready to vote? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Item carries. Next item is 1020 Old Post Road.
This property, Mr. Chairman, is 2 doors down from the town's main library. There's a house adjacent to it. The next house is for sale. The town is contemplating the purchase of that property mainly to facilitate the expansion of the parking lot behind the adjacent property for library parking. There's a fair amount of on-street parking that takes place now. The town is looking for an opportunity here to expand the parking capacity at the library. So that is a special exception application that does also require public hearing.
Move to approve.
Commissioner McAleese?
Or move to public hearing, excuse me.
I'll second.
Commissioner Legge? So, any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so that item carries. And last, 936 Sasko Hill Road.
Yes, this is simply the Country Club of Fairfield existing. They're looking to replace their clubhouse, pro shop, and cart barn facilities. Also a special exception use that does require public hearing.
Do I have a motion?
Motion to move to public hearing?
Mr. McAleese, Mr. Levy. Any discussion?
Nope.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Abstentions? That item carries. So we now move to public hearing. Yep. So our public hearing is a zoning regulation amendment, application of Hall House Group LLC to amend section 12.5.5, permitted uses in the neighborhood design district.
Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Raymond Rizzio. Happy to be before you tonight with regard to this text amendment. I'm going to use this here as well. I'm going to give you a couple of handouts first so that we can kind of see what we're talking about, put everything in perspective. Chris, will you come up? Well, you know what? So this is first would be a map of all the neighborhood design districts so that you know where they are and where they'll affect. Saves you Winston from doing that and then Winston time. Do that. Next is the actual regulations, so you don't have to read through everything. I'm highlighting some areas which we're going to be talking about tonight. And last is taking my own pictures. Keep Walgreens in business and send all these things down, support local businesses. This one's not in the neighborhood design district. All right, so this is a very interesting application. Chairman, I've been involved with a lot of applications that have had mixed-use projects, and one of the issues that have come back, and actually it's been some of your more successful projects in town have had to deal with this issue of how do we handle mixed-use buildings. And in these neighborhood design districts, center design districts, and there's issues that we have dealt with. In a neighborhood design district, when you have a mixed-use building or you want to put residential, there's a limitation that no more than 50% of the building can be residential, and the residential can't be on the first floor. We think the neighborhood design district's a little different than the center design district, which are really, the center design district is designed for really a walking, you know, keeping the downtown, keeping the retail on the first floor, keeping offices on the first floor, and then putting residents above and having people move downtown, but there's a 50% restriction. Neighborhood design district's a little bit different. Neighborhood design district is kind of a transitional zone. I marked in on the top all the different zones for where the neighborhood design district is, and as you can see, it typically abuts it's typically on major roads, abutting residential areas, and acts as kind of a transition and a local kind of flair to it. Some of the issues that happened, and if you look, and I'll take you through some of them, is that most of these buildings are non-conforming. They were all built prior to the regulations or built before the regulations changed. They don't conform with parking requirements. They just, it was a way of having these neighborhood design districts, but kind of nothing that really can conform. So we have looked at this project. Our client owns a piece of property in a neighborhood design district, and he's got multiple buildings. And we don't want to compromise the mixed use concept. What we would like to do is, when there's multiple buildings on a property, the ability to have one building be commercial, one building be residential, whether it's the first floor or not, yet still have the keep the 50% rule intact. So if you look at basically the regulation, which I gave you also, and then we'll take you through the specifics, talks about how the purpose of the neighborhood design district is to provide local neighborhoods with needed and desirable convenience, goods, and services in a manner which will not be detrimental to the surrounding residential area. The uses permitted in this zone shall not be limited to those which will be primarily serve the local neighborhood and are consistent with the purpose of the district was designed. So one of the interesting things, and I find baffling, is you have a transitional zone and you have some resistance about putting residential housing in a transitional zone where there's businesses. So 12.55 is the section which we're looking to address. In 12.55, if you look on page 2, it's page 48, it says residential use provided it shall not be, or permitted, shall not be located on the ground floor and not to exceed more than 50% of the total area of the building. And no building of mixed residential business shall contain more than 2 stories devoted to residential use. We want to change that. If you look in your package, there's our suggested language, and our language would say residential uses provided such uses may not be permitted on the ground floor of a property containing a single building. In the event a property contains multiple buildings, at least one of the buildings must have a ground floor that does not contain a residential use. In both such instances, the total floor area of the residential use of the entire property must not exceed more than 50% of the total floor area of all the buildings, thereby preserving the mixed-use component. So there's a bunch of things in the regulation that, if they're taken to heart, for example, if you turn another page, basically to page 52, and it's with regard to some of the coverage and the bulk requirements and everything else. So for example, in a neighborhood design district, you can be 3 stories high and no more than 30 feet. And you can't have more than 50%. So if you're 3 stories high, you have to split your second floor if you want to split the building up. So in other words, you can't have a second and third floor just be residential. Half of it would have to be commercial, which makes no sense. And what we're trying to say, if there's multiple buildings on a piece of property, that as long as you maintain your 50%, and as long as you could still have residential on the first floor and still have a mixed-use component on the property. And that's what we think is important. A couple of examples that I would use that have been successful developments in town, although not necessarily in the neighborhood design district, is, for example, Southport Green. Southport Green is basically 50% residential, 50% commercial. A bulk of the units are nice standalone units, and you have probably your best example of a mixed-use development in town.
Sorry, where is that exactly?
Southport Green is like down next to down in Southport. You know where the Grey Goose is? It's funny that the Grey Goose stands up more than Southport. The Delamar Hotel, Artisan. All of that was one big development, but that development had to go through the ZBA. And the only way to get the 50% approved was to go through the ZBA, and that's really not the way we want to, to do good planning and development. But for example, another project that was like that is on 1 Post Road, which is about to be constructed, where you have 30,000 square feet of office, and you're going to have 30,000 feet of residential, and the buildings aren't next to each other. But it's all on the same property, provides in a design district, it'll provide for a mixed use, yet still keeping the balance of commercial to residential, yet allowing each of the uses to flourish on their own without having any negative impact on each other. See, when you have multiple use buildings, we believe it's important that they also be able to flourish and function to the best of their ability, and especially when you have cross purposes for parking. So we believe if you have two buildings, provided you can maintain the 50% rule, you would have the ability to have a whole building that's residential on the same lot that contains a whole building of office. And the reason a lot of that is amenity packages, the mix of office and the time uses of each of the buildings. We believe it flourishes much better, and not really any negative impacts. For example, like we talk about in the neighborhood design district, I'll take you through some specific things. In the neighborhood design district, I don't know, I would say 80% of the properties there are probably not pre-existing non-conforming. And the biggest reason they're pre-existing non-conforming is they don't have any parking. They're all underparked. Any of the offices have parking that's half in the street, no circulation, everything else. Well, one of the things that allowing a building to be, if you had multiple buildings, one building to be residential and one building to be commercial, is you would reduce the parking requirement, because it would make it, these properties tend to be more conforming with regard to parking. For example, for each 1,000 square foot unit, you need 2 parking spaces. For each 1,000 square feet of office, you need 4 parking spaces. So all in all, it provides, we believe, a good cohesive way to develop the buildings. What I try to do, because what always comes up at these hearings when you make a text amendment, is who's it going to affect, where is it going to affect, and what kind of issues will come about with this. We believe this is a good way to kind of dip your toe in the water with regard to this first floor residential. If you look at the Greenfield Hills section, which is the first one, and probably we put the pictures kind of in order so that you can see that's where the Tesco's catering is. There's a 2-story office building, one of the buildings that would be able to benefit from this, which the 2-story office building, which I actually have pictures of that too. I want to make it clear, especially for my counsel behind us, that this is only by way of example and not in any manner designed for any specific project. So, for example, in a situation like an office building that may have 2 buildings, like the one in there's one in Greenfield Hill. In that building, you have the office, the building that you're looking at in front. Now, the building in that instance doesn't have conforming parking. The building in the front is 100% office. The building in the back is approved for a first floor, second and third. The third floor is residential. A little more than half of the second floor is residential, and the first floor is commercial.
So
Which
you're
doesn't
talking
seem to make a lot of sense.
This picture?
Yes,
It appears to be a 2-story building.
there's a loft areas on the back building. This is not, like I said, this is not an application for this building. This is just by way of example. I'm trying to show in an instance where you have multiple buildings, how you end up with the way this regulation's written and the way we believe that we can straighten it out, that you end up with a confluence of uses, not really for what the building, what the regs were intended. We believe the regs were intended to bring a balance of commercial and residential, but not to strictly limit it to one building and one floor. And that's one of the reasons we think that if you have multiple buildings on a property and you can maintain the 50%, you should be allowed to have one of the buildings be residential and one of the buildings to be completely commercial. That will continue the balance of uses on the property, compatibility of uses with regard to parking, and in this instance, lower the parking density or the parking requirements on a particular piece. If you take a look at the map, and I just use this building for example, if you go to second page, you have Southport. In that Southport section, which you have pictures of also, there's no real 2 buildings on a site. There are most buildings are non-conforming. Most buildings don't park very well. For example, where the driftwood is, where some of the office buildings are, and some of the smaller office buildings. The third page, if you go to Reef Road, which is a neighborhood design district, you have where 7-Eleven is, you have Frontier Communications, then the corner of Millard Street, you have a balance where you have 3 buildings on one street on the corner of Millard and Reef Road, and all 3 of those buildings are, I think they're 2 or 3 floors, but each of the 3 buildings is entirely residential, non-conforming, doesn't really work. If you go to Black Rock Turnpike, Jennings Road, you'll see there's really not much of the ability to put multiple buildings on that site, although there's a few non-conforming houses on the south side of Jennings Road as you head down toward Kings Highway. You have a CVS on the corner, you have an office building, you have a gas station. The next one is up on Black Rock Turnpike and Tungus Hill Road. What's important about this is, and this is why I think it's important when you have transitional, there's a bunch of different office and retail uses along this corridor, but they also abut condominium or multifamily uses on either side. So once again, by allowing to have a residential building in this zone, you manage to continue with the spirit of this being a transitional zone, but you also continue to accomplish the goal of the balance of 50% residential and 50% commercial. Now you look at Tungus Hill and Old Strathfield Road, and it is probably the most non-conforming commercial strip of property in the entire town. I don't know anybody has conforming parking. I don't know anybody has, there's as many uses that have first floor residential as they do and are totally 100% residential as anywhere in all of the districts. This is the area where Liana's is. It's the corner of Old Stratfield Hill Road and Tungus Hill Road, and most of you didn't realize this. NDD, went in that deep on Old Stratfield Road, going to the east. If you go to the next project, it's Stratfield Road and Fairfield Woods Road, much more of a typical neighborhood design district, meaning 4 corners. One thing that's interesting though, is you look on the northwest corner, you'll see once again, it abuts multifamily housing. But once again, a good traditional transitional use. The last is Brooklawn Avenue, next to last is Brooklawn Avenue, where you go to the new Testo's Pizzeria, Suburban Avenue, where there's multifamilies, non-conforming small businesses, and none of the properties are anywhere near close to the parking requirements that are required. Last but not least, in trying to figure this one out, is where the Sea Grape is and the hotel is, and then half of College Park, which backs up to the Sea Grape and the hotel, is also in the neighborhood design district, and those are all first floor residential units. So it's not really, what we're asking for is not really out of conformance with what currently exists in these zones, but we believe leads to better development, better management of properties, yet continues your goal of having this as mixed-use zones with the balance of remaining 50-50 with regard to commercial and mixed use. People also, as you know, throughout town, are looking for this type of use. They want to be in an area where they can live. They're trying to downsize. They want to be in an area that's convenient and that there are services there. So making residential available without disturbing the balance between residential and commercial seems to make a lot of sense. And that's really our regulation. I mean, the otherwise what happens is multiple, I can see at least 3 and there's another one over on Sherman Street, which was a center design district where the first floor is 400 feet commercial, it's 85% residential and 15% commercial. Behind Quattro Pazzi, there's like 5 units that have small home offices on the first floor.
I have a couple questions, if I can interrupt you here.
Sure.
Okay. First of all, just for my own knowledge, these properties that are not in conformity in these things, do they need to become into conformity if they're sold?
They need to become in conformity if they're redeveloped.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for example, if somebody wants to buy 3 properties,
Yeah, okay.
they can buy the 3 properties. When they tear down those properties, they now have to be 50% commercial, 50% residential. We would not mind if one of the buildings was residential and one was commercial, as long as they kept the balance.
So, let me ask, I think the next section, 12.5.6, offers a greater residential balance. Have you considered that? That we have that there, that's available to do this kind of...
You know, it's really an awkward type regulation, because they basically tell you, we'll give you the increase in density, but we'll give you the increase in density, but they have to be affordable, so there's really no incentive for anybody to ever take advantage of that regulation. Where
they
if
have
you
to
could
be-
have the entire building, because remember, you can only have 3 stories, so you'd have 1 story that's gonna be residential. We can only have, only 1.5 of the stories can be residential anyway. So you don't really get the bump, because you
Well,
can
no,
only,
it's 66 2/3, isn't it?
Yeah.
yeah, but that's, I don't see how you really carve that up unless you get unless you can have an entire building that's residential. And we're only talking about that where there's multiple buildings
Well, I
on the
mean,
property.
we have, like, for example, the building at the corner of Burroughs Road and Black Rock Turnpike, which is a 3-story building with 2 stories of residential above and commercial below. Isn't that what this describes?
2/3.
What's that?
Well, you were saying you wouldn't be able to get the density, but...
No, I'm saying the density, the driver of adding a third, a little bit more residential, if you make it affordable, I don't really think is a realistic financial driver for somebody to sign up, to build a couple of extra units that they're gonna lose money on, versus just stick with the 50% rule. And we're not looking to change your balance. We're not looking for an increase in density. We're looking for an ability for a project to make sense. So for example, there's the 2 buildings in Greenfield Hill. Rather than having 1 building that's completely residential and 1 building that's completely commercial, we would be forced to have a floor and a half in each of the buildings be residential if we wanted to have a 50% balance, which just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to us. And keep in mind, one thing that's really important about this, none of this is an over-the-counter approval. All of this is a special permit, special exception, which comes before you to prove to you that in this instance, these things make sense.
So, could you comment on this? I would think that one of the original purposes of this regulation was to have, in these neighborhood design districts, to have first floor businesses that would be used by the neighborhood. And if you maintain it at 50%, you're going to be talking about second floor businesses, right, in one of the buildings?
Second floor business, yeah.
Yeah,
If you have,
and also there's nothing in here about the relative size of the buildings. It just says one building can be...
in the neighborhood design district, you're limited to 14,000 square feet.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is that I think that the original purpose was to have storefront kinds of buildings where you would stop in and buy a newspaper or an office where customers come and so on. And it seems to me that the idea was for these to be on the ground floor.
Right.
And if you're moving them into a building where they're not on the ground floor anymore, I don't think maybe that's not serving the purpose that
Well,
was originally thought of.
yes and no. And then also, the world changes. And the type of uses change and people's demands change. So if you're in a property, you really want to live above a restaurant, where you could have a restaurant right next door to you within the same property. Secondly, with regard to the storefronts and the walkability, these are pockets. And I think the walkability really is for along the post road, where you have a long corridor of street front buildings with parking in the rear, kind of what we've achieved on the post road. which is a lot different than the pockets that that I've shown you in the neighborhood design district. We're only dealing with the neighborhood design district, which deals with those specific neighborhoods that we have, that I put before you, and only in an instance where there's multiple buildings on one property. So I want to be clear, we are not looking to rewrite your regulations. We are looking at the situations where One Post Road, Southport Green, there's a couple others that I did, where you have properties that have different type of systems needed, have different type of uses, abilities to have compatible parking times, compatible uses, uniformity of uses within a site, yet the mixed-use component on the property. And I don't know of a better mixed-use project that I've seen than Southport Green. You have a hotel, you have a restaurant, you have underground parking, you have office, and then you have wrapped with residential, all on the same piece of property. That to me is ideal. That is great urban planning. That is great, and I'd be careful using the word urban, suburban, however you want to put it. We're not looking to call Fairfield. But in that instance, you have a good working neighborhood. So if somebody wants to go next door where the lights are on and the people are working in their office, but they don't want to be disturbed, you know, because the office is making noise, and on the same property they can live and work, still walk to work if they want to be in that apartment. So we think what happens, and especially when you look at these neighborhoods that we're dealing with are not kind of what you described or haven't developed into what you've described. They are pre-existing non-conforming properties which had little businesses that go there, which had businesses that kind of just developed over time, either by way of variance or by way of old type use, versus the planning that the planners are working with in the Commerce Drive district, the downtown district, the TODs. These are these pocket neighborhoods which are underparked, very difficult to have mixed use. Most of them don't. Most of those properties in there aren't mixed use, and gives you the ability to create mixed use, yet still keep your balance. You understand? That's why I thought it was important. Normally, everybody, you know, says, "Oh, geez, we get to these hearings, you make a text amendment," and it's probably Jim, Emmeline, and Matt's worst nightmare, because the first question is, where are all these things? And in this instance, it actually, I think, the type of neighborhoods that they are, the type of development that has gone on, it actually supports our argument, and I'm happy. There's no smoking gun. There's nothing being hidden. This is, we believe, and once again, no matter what, they've got to come back to you to show conformity with the neighborhood, show anybody that wants to build a new one that they have proper architectural plans in place. The one nice thing about your design residence district, the regulations, almost 20 pages long. And if you look at all of the architectural standards, appearance standards, there are so many protections in there from somebody coming in and sliding in something that you don't want to see. I haven't seen anybody being very successful doing that, and this is not something that would be approved over the counter. So,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
So I hear what you're saying, but I don't know that people would be happy with it who live around neighborhood design districts also having really lovely, charming little units that are nothing but high-end residential units on the first floor, which is what this is going to
Keep in
allow,
mind,
correct?
They could only do that on a first
In one
floor if
separate
there were
building.
multiple buildings, and that property itself supported 50% of it being commercial. So we're not talking about,
Yeah, if you have two separate buildings
Right.
on 5 different lots, you're going to have 5 residential buildings on the ground floor in that block, in that
No,
district.
on one
You
piece of
potentially
property.
could, but you potentially could have that. You know, like, for example, the one down by, the one you showed us. As you were talking, it dawned on me, I'm thumbing through this, and you're saying how, they don't seem to be working very well as mixed use as they stand. I'm looking at all these, they have thriving businesses. You mentioned Liana's. There's, this whole neighborhood right here, they were all outside these windows. These are nice, working, thriving, mixed-use residential neighborhood design districts. That's what they were designed to do, and they're working.
But they're not mixed-use properties.
Not the properties, but the neighborhood is.
So
The
we're
district is.
I
That's why the
understand that.
district was created. Instead of on a lot, it's for the district to help the neighborhood. I don't have to have residential on the site. I have residential right out here, across the street. And that's what the people want, to be able to walk to their store, get a gallon of milk, pick up their dry cleaning, maybe pop into the dentist, get their nails done. That's the intent of these
They will
districts.
still have the ability to do that. We're not reducing the amount of commercial use. We're
Well,
basically.
you're introducing residential to the ground floor where it's not allowed now. And then some of these, like this one's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lots. There's not potential for 9 ground floor residential units on those.
How would
right?
that be?
Isn't
They'd
that what
have
you're-
to have, they'd have to have an additional building that's 100% commercial. Or an additional building that is commercial. Yeah, and I think
If
maybe,
it's
I
big
hope,
enough for
I don't know if
multiple
I
buildings.
explained this correctly. Maybe I didn't explain this correctly, or my language in the regulation that's proposed, if we want to
Okay,
take
go
through
ahead,
it.
sure.
This regulation applies only in the event a property has two buildings on it, multiple buildings, and at least one of the buildings has first floor commercial, and the entire property remains 50% commercial versus 50% residential. So what you're not doing is, you are not reducing the commercial aspects of the property or the availability of it. You're allowing this to be developed the way this commission has granted other projects in the past. Unfortunately, they've done it through ZBA waivers versus planning and development in a special permit process. And all this does is give us the ability to apply. It doesn't give us the right to do it, so that if you don't think it makes sense, or you don't like the look of it, or you think that there's not adequate parking, or the uses aren't compatible enough, or I can take you through your special 20 pages of this, you can deny it. Or it's not compatible with the neighborhood. You like a better streetscape. But in the instances which you found through the ZBA, Southport Green, other parts of the Post Road, where 2 independent buildings can work very well on a piece of property, you have the ability to do that. Problem is, you go through the ZBA, and it's really not the way to go. But this commission has granted these it's not groundbreaking, but it's just trying to make it available to you versus going through a zoning board of appeals process. That's all. We're not reducing the percentages. We're not changing the character, because your character is so well written in here that you can, if it's not compliant with that character, you can deny it. But in the cases which this commission has found before, where it works to have, where there's multiple buildings, to have a residential component and a commercial component and have them work together, you have the ability to grant that. We're not asking for any approval of any specific property tonight. We're just saying, in this instance where there's multiple buildings on a property, can we please apply to you to see if you find that this would be acceptable? That's all. We're not taking away first floor storefronts. We're not expanding the amount of residential. We're not increasing the height. We just want to know, when there's a mix, in the instances that it makes sense to separate versus put them in one building, or put them in two half-full buildings, we have the ability to come before you with a situation that could make sense. The commission's found that in the past, that these situations do make sense in different mixed zones. Unfortunately, they had to come by way of the ZBA. But in this instance, we would just have the ability to apply to you, and you can say, you know what? We think in this instance, because of the whole neighborhood has this first floor commercial, we want to keep first floor commercial there, and you have the ability to apply, but it doesn't mean we have to approve you. And I know this commission doesn't do well with things jammed down their throat, so we're not looking to jam down anybody's throat. It's just basically giving us the ability to apply to you in a situation where there's multiple buildings, which is what you approved in the past. Yes.
I have one question. The proposed reg uses the word property, and I don't think we define property. I mean, what do you think of as a property? For instance, if I purchase two adjoining lots with two buildings on it, and then want to make an application, would that be a single property
That's
at that
exactly,
point?
you know what's funny? That's exactly what you've approved down on One Post Road.
Okay.
So One Post Road, if you can remember,
Mhm. I'm
was
familiar
a
with it.
strip center
Mhm.
and an office building. They had similarity of ownership. The lot line, the properties that will file the consolidation map and merged. And this commission granted an approval to allow
Mhm.
the office and the housing component being separate properties, being separate buildings. Nothing said you had to approve that. You know, even with the waiver in place, you could have said it didn't make sense, doesn't work, it doesn't meet the guidelines that you have, which are very strict and very, you know, you certainly are not taking away any of your special exception discretionary powers that you have. So yes, you can combine lots. And the beauty of that is, and this is the perfect example. I have to know because my office has been there for 25 years. 59 Post Road was a little strip center that you would see in these neighborhood design districts. It sat up on the Post Road. It had a 10-foot driveway with 4 parking spaces in the rear for a 5,000 square foot shopping center. By being able to consolidate the lots, combine the 30,000 feet of office with the 30,000 feet of residential, you're now going to get a 20-unit apartment building where people can walk to work, yet walk within the neighborhood to the other properties that belong. Never jeopardizing the 50% rule. So you got 50% residential, 50% commercial. You're going to have this nice apartment building that overlooks the water, and you're going to have a nice office building that overlooks the water, and the people have the ability to. Same thing as if they were in one building, but absolutely makes a lot of sense. Think about if you had a choice. If you could live in a building on the same piece of property where you're within a residential building and you had an office next door to you or other kind of retail, and it was still the 50-50, the similarity of uses works on the same property in multiple buildings. And that's kind of what this is getting at. And what this commission has looked at before, approved before, and have been very successful projects. And once again, it's only the ability to apply to tell you that in this instance it makes sense. That's it.
So would we have
that
to
was
do-
actually the perfect example of
Would we
lots being
then,
consolidated.
would we then need to define property as a contiguous lots with a unity of ownership?
No, because it has to be one single, I guess we could say one single lot or one, we're not married to the word property, but we're talking about one, I don't know how is it just called one lot under the regs? I'm not sure. But one lot. It used to be 5963 Post Road and 1 Post Road. It's all now going to be one lot. There is no multiple lots. There is no abutting lots. It is consolidation maps filed. There's a condition of approval, and it is one piece of property, 50% commercial, 50% residential, and 2 buildings that we think will work great. It basically, believe it or not, in that instance, you got rid of the horrible parking for the shopping center. You actually increased the amount of parking that was available to the office building, and the parking for the overall project grew and became more conforming than the 2 pieces by themselves. All subject to your discretion, but having to go through the ZBA. What's the hardship? The ZBA basically said it makes sense, good planning, let's go through, and we came to you folks, but you folks had every right to deny that if you had to. So that's the perfect example of when you have non-conforming properties around conforming properties where you get to increase the parking, no negative effect on density. In fact, you get to solve some problems. And these neighborhood design districts down the road are going to will need to be redeveloped as times change. And this, we think, is a tool where there's multiple properties that you're not hamstrung going to the ZBA for a project that makes sense. So Commissioner McAleese, do you understand where I'm, am I better did I not explain well with the reg as far as that this is only applying where there's multiple properties on one lot?
I guess. I'm sort of concerned with what Commissioner Levy was talking about too. That was in the back of my mind too. How do we define the property? But I think what you just said.
It's really no different
clarified
than a
little bit.
single-family house on a lot. I don't know, do we refer to everything, Jim, as lots or property? I don't have the regulations in front of me. Oh, I'm sorry. Through the chair, can we ask Mr. Wendt the question? Yes.
Donan has a question. He's been waiting.
So, well, at least look at it.
Do you have a question?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Jim Wendt for the record. I think, the intent, the way we talk about it in the regs, I'd have to look this, and I will get back to you if the answer is going to be different, but I think we use the word parcel. Property parcel, I think the intent is that it be a single parcel, that it not be multiple parcels that now may be owned by a single entity that have multiple buildings. They'd have to be combined into a single property or parcel. So I think that's the intent. If the word property is a sticking point, we can clarify that, but I'll take a quick look at the reg to see if we use different nomenclature.
The intention would be where it's single ownership, on one parcel with multiple buildings.
Mr. Meyer
Counselor,
has.
do you know, did you come up with a statistic on how many of these NDD properties have multiple buildings today? You said something about.
I can give you that information if we end up continuing this matter tonight.
You obviously did a lot of research. I was wondering if that, because that's really what we're talking about. That's the number
Sure.
of properties affected by that.
Well, it is and it isn't, and I'll tell you why. And I don't know if I'm helping or hurting myself, but the question is going to come up, and at least I'm part of the conversation. Like we talked about on Post Road, you can have consolidation of properties.
Okay.
You can have, so you have the ability to, if you consolidate, put two properties on, but the properties would then then both properties would be subject to being B1, and they'd be subject to a 50% rule.
Okay.
And we believe that by doing that, typically what the balance happens is you allow the properties to become more conforming. As you look through that map, what you will find is most of these properties their uses are too small for the lots. They end up with parking on the street, parking on the sidewalks, people parking in front of these little retail stores, which is, love it. Except you've got half the cars hanging out on the street. It gives you the ability to provide a mechanism with which, if you consolidate, you can grow, still in the spirit of your reg, but to bring the property more in conformance with your regulations.
Now,
So that, I could give you that list. The question
doesn't- it
becomes,
doesn't-
wherever there's a lot
it
next
won't-
to
if
each other, they can be
properties are
combined.
purchased and consolidated,
Right.
that number
Correct.
becomes kind of irrelevant. So I get that. Are you proposing to remove the rest of the language from?
No, it's 12.55 is just,
No, I mean, what is not highlighted in your?
the only thing we're
submission?
looking to do is strike what you see stricken and add the language with
Okay.
regard to multiple
So
use.
what
But
about
everything,
what exists today, each dwelling unit must have, are you taking that out of the, so when you highlighted this 12.55?
no.
That's all
No,
staying?
everything below, and I apologize. So what I have the only section of that regulation that we're changing is what I have
The
highlighted
rest
in
will
orange.
stay?
Correct.
Okay. Just
Everything
checking.
else remains.
Okay.
So you have no impact with regard to elderly families. You still have the 750 square foot requirement of each of the units.
Okay.
All we're doing is saying, we want to be able to come with you and when we shuffle the deck, figure out exactly how to shuffle the deck in a way that makes sense, but not change your balance of uses on a property. that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, upon further review, Jim Wendt again for the record. I mean, property, I think the intent, the word lot is what we use most commonly in our regulations. So if that were problematic on a lot containing a single building, the answer to Commissioner Meyer's question, snapshot view today as ownership is presently constituted, as lots are currently drawn, the answer to your question is 3. It's pretty limited applicability as we sit here today. There is obviously the possibility for lot consolidation, which to combine multiple lots into a single lot. So if the word property is problematic, I would suggest to perhaps the word lot would be a suitable substitution.
As you know, with text amendments, we would certainly agree to that. You're acting in your legislative capacity, and you can throw all of my language out and draft it however you want. But we would certainly have no objection to using the word lot versus property. Our intent, I think, I tend to repeat myself if you haven't noticed, but these guys may have heard it once or twice. Our intent is it to only apply to a situation where there's 2 buildings on 1 lot, either currently or consolidated in the future, and not to change any other part of that reg except which we had in.
Feel that this is going to encourage consolidation.
Do I feel it's going to encourage consolidation? It
Is
may.
that part of your motivation?
No, not at all. Part of our motivation would be we believe we haven't, we believe my client owns a piece of property which we think is unfairly burdened by this regulation, and the ability to keep the 50% requirement, yet to have 1 building be residential and 1 be commercial on the same lot. He happens to be one of the 3 property owners that have this situation, we think makes a lot of sense. Now keep in mind, if you pass this regulation, or you amend your text amendment, it just gives us the ability to come back for you to determine whether it does make sense. You're not in any way granting our application.
Right, understood.
Just gives us the ability to come back and talk about, hey, do we have enough screening? Does this use make sense here? Is it the proper balance and look that we like to see? All of those, I mean, you've got 10 pages of protection. I don't know that there's a more, I don't want to say cumbersome, but certainly from a development standpoint, there's certainly not a more thorough or detailed regulation on your books than the designs and requirements that come with these design business districts. So we're not really asking for anything except to please come back before you.
Do we have all the neighborhood design districts in this packet?
Unless I missed one on the map. To me,
The
those are-
Southport Green one you keep referring to, I don't see.
No,
it on
what I
here.
said was Southport Green is not a design, it's a mixed district, but it wasn't a design residence. Some were center business
okay.
districts, some had received different type of zone.
This is just, that's why I was just curious.
One Post Road is not a design neighborhood district.
Right.
It's along the Post Road, so it's a center design district, a little different. Center design district, I'm sorry, not downtown design district. So there's,
Because I agree with you, I think it's a hugely successful project, although it took some time to get there, but that was for other reasons, I think. And, you know, I mean, I can understand your argument in using that as an example, but it also is not this. This is, again, you know, this is a small, cozy place. That's a very nice, lovely hotel and fantastic restaurant, and I don't know what kind of offices, commercial offices are in there. And let's face it, the houses aren't like little under 1,000 square foot condos. They're mini mansions. They're big, beautiful homes. So
No,
it's a
there's-
whole different animal from this. So I can't wrap my head around how I'm supposed to use that to help me understand what you want to do here.
no, what I'm saying is the mixed use.
It's like comparing Disney World to Rye Playland. I mean,
Well, well, for example, in a neighborhood design district, so you don't have to worry about these things getting out of control, you're limited to 14,000 square feet in a building, okay? So, and of those uses, or no matter if you had multiple buildings, say you could have 28,000 square feet, but you have all the bulk regulations and everything. It's just a question of the size. The coverage in those districts and the uses in those districts are not any different. It's just a question of the size of the lot. So we're not looking to change anything but the ability to come back before you with something that we think makes sense. If you don't think it makes sense, you deny the special permit. But I can tell you, there's projects around town where it's worked. They've been very successful. Unfortunately, they've had to go through the ZBA waiver. And I can tell you for a fact, because I know I'm being involved with it, the reason Southport Green got held up for so long was you had a neighbor who appealed the ZBA, and it ended up in court for years until finally the neighbor, went away. So what we're trying to do is not make this a court battle over something that really isn't a hardship issue, it's a planning issue. And we're asking the ability to make an application before you for planning. I can tell you right now, maybe Mr. Green will bring it up. We did go to the ZBA, and we got appealed, but we had no hardship. In fact, I think we originally talked about this maybe a couple of years ago, and I think the chairman said, you're arguing something that's unique. If it's unique, go to the ZBA and see how you do there before you come back here. Well, we're back. We got approved by the ZBA. We got appealed, and you lose in court because you don't have a hardship. So we never made it to you. What we do is hope to make it to you, and if you tell us differently in the ZBA that it doesn't make sense, then we don't have an approval. But I think to prevent somebody from, which I think you can see in certain circumstances, splitting your uses up on the same property doesn't necessarily have a detrimental effect. You have the same amount of residential on a property, so you're gonna have the same amount of residences, and you're gonna have the same amount of commercial uses. And you can decide whether they work or not. I know you have voted, or this commission has voted in a few instances where it's worked, and it's gonna work. But that doesn't mean you have to vote for it every time. You won't. So we just want the ability to present our case to you in a situation where there's multiple buildings that we believe this makes sense. You have all the tools, if this thing doesn't make sense, to say, you know what, Mr. Rizzio, Commissioner McAleese, you can tell me, you know what, I don't really like it here. This one doesn't make sense because of X. That's all we're looking to do. As you can see, and I hope I described, the projects where it works, different districts, but mixed use and separate buildings. Same restrictions apply in the center design district and in the downtown district, although I think your regulations are going to be changing in the future as to the center design or TOD areas. But with regard to this 50% rule on the first floor, that goes along in all three districts. We just believe in the neighborhood design where you hopefully will have the ability down the road to get rid of some nonconformities, to make properties more conforming. We want the ability to come before you and make these type of requests. That's kind of where we are. I don't know that you're giving anything up. You're just giving a property owner a tool with which to develop their property that you may like or dislike. And if you dislike it, I can tell you, I know Commissioner McAleese, you'll deny it. I'm not thoroughly.
I guess my concern is like having the fabric start to sort of wear down. You know, you have 5 buildings, and the second and the fourth are residential on the first floor, and then suddenly you don't have this nice little pocket like we see on the corner of Stratfield and Brookline. You know, 4 stores in a row. If there were a residential unit in the second one, that starts to.
Let me ask you a question from another side. You'll have the ability to make all these decisions.
Yes. Yeah.
You have a property along Brookline Avenue that's a liquor store, and you got to back out onto the street. But because they've combined they managed to keep a liquor store, keep residential, be able to get their people out back onto the street safely, but keep the same uses there. Combine it with the residents and give you the ability to have a property that's more conforming. Why would you deny yourself that tool to, certainly from a public health and safety, when you look at a lot of these properties? I love Leon's, one of my favorite restaurants in town. If there was a way to make that work where you had parking, that you're not hanging out onto the street, that there's no sidewalk, that people are coming around the corner, that you don't have the ability to bring those little businesses under today's rules and say, you know what? if you want to change this, we're going to make you conform and make you operate safely. You don't have to sacrifice quaintness, you don't have to sacrifice services for progress or conformity. None of that has to happen. But I got to tell you, when you look at a lot of those stores that are quaint and they're nice, but they're not, a lot of them aren't safe, and a lot of them work or don't work well. But you will always have that authority. We're not looking to take anything away from you. We're just saying, if we think we can mix our property up better than the regulation requires, we would like to be able to come before you and see if it makes sense. That's what we're looking for.
Any more questions from the panel? Anything?
I told my wife I'd be home at 8:30. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure I'm going to listen to Mr. Green, and I will be back. I'm happy to answer any questions the commissioners have.
I think we've covered them. Thank you. Comment from the public?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, staff. My name is Joel Green. I practice law in Bridgeport with the law offices of Green and Gross. It's my pleasure to appear before you this evening on behalf of the Greenfield Hill Village Improvement Society in opposition to this application. I really don't know where to begin, but I have to make a couple of comments. The applicant, Attorney Rizzio, said 3 times, we're not really asking for anything because we have to come back. Twice, we're not looking to rewrite your regulations, and you're not giving anything up. This is an application for a text amendment. The applicant is asking you to rewrite your regulations. That is exactly what is happening here. And the applicant is asking you to rewrite your regulations in a manner that simply does not make sense. And it's for the benefit of a single property owner. And this applicant has not identified a single purpose that benefits the overall community of neighborhood design business districts. It benefits the applicant's client because the applicant's client wants to have residential uses on the ground floor on his 2 buildings that exist on a single lot of land. There is no definition in the zoning regulations, by the way, of property or parcel, as Mr. Wendt had confirmed. And in fact, there's no definition of building, which is also used in the applicant's regulation. What is the problem here? What is the planning problem that has been identified for the town? And it seems to me that if anything, Attorney Rizzio demonstrated that maybe you should be looking at your parking regulations in neighborhood design business districts to encourage development. Now, another premise that Attorney Rizzio seems to be pushing is this notion that it was the goal of the neighborhood design business district to have 50% residential and 50% commercial. But that's not expressed at all in the regulation. That's not what it is expressed. Neighborhood design business districts appear, now there are some exceptions in terms of development, the way it's laid out, and pre-existing conditions, but generally speaking, these are small commercial pockets that are surrounded by residential zones. And what the applicant is looking to do will erode the neighborhood design business districts by creating, for example, residential uses on ground floors so that you can have alternating, theoretically, commercial uses, then a residential use like an apartment or some sort of a dwelling, and then another commercial use. That's not what this was designed to be. The regulation is clear. It's going to alter the commercial and pedestrian-oriented streetscape in these districts. That's what's going to happen here. And it's of great concern to my client in terms of the Greenfield Hill Village. If we are going to start talking about buildings, then owners will separate their buildings into 2 structures. They can separate a wall. I don't know how many of those buildings have, for example, separate demising walls in them, where the applicant can march in and say, these are actually 2 buildings on this single lot, and now I want to put a residential use on the ground floor. That was never the intent of this neighborhood design business district. It was to provide convenient goods and services And the commission smartly said, you know what, if you want to put a residence over the top, that, you know, that's more permissible because generally you're not going to have a store on the second floor in these kinds of districts. So that property can be used. So that property can be used. We'll allow the residential use there. And it makes perfect sense. And then I thought it was a clever incentive to say, once again, to address the need for affordable housing in our town, we're going to relax it. We're going to relax it if you will provide affordable housing. Help us meet our need for affordable housing. Makes perfect sense. Waiving these developments like Southport Green that are not in these developments, or any of the other developments that the applicant identified that aren't in neighborhood design business districts, while attractive and while they may work, really has nothing to do with this. Because you can probably point out instances where mixed uses are not appropriate. We can probably point out areas in town where there are commercial uses, where residential uses combined with them may not be appropriate. For example, directly on Route 1 in our downtown. So there's all kinds of examples outside of these areas, and it doesn't make sense to you know, sort of say this is attractive, this works, if it's not a neighborhood design business district. And so I wouldn't be, it's kind of a seductive argument, but it really doesn't apply here. The consequences are really uncertain in terms of how it works with the lack of definitions in these regulations. It discourages actually commercial uses. It discourages the development of these, once again, these districts providing convenience, providing sort of essential local neighborhood things. And once again, you might start looking at your regulations and say, how can we promote and foster better development in these areas by, once again, looking at parking and those sorts of things. But it's a larger planning function. And it's not a, hey, don't worry about this because we have to come back on a special permit. Because I've been on the other side of the special permit argument also, where then it's your regulations specifically allow it, and we've satisfied traffic, we've satisfied character, we've satisfied harmony, crowding, and that sort of thing, and you have to give it to us now, sort of arguments. So let's not, so that we're not asking for anything because we have to come back. I've heard the other side of that argument as well. How does this really benefit the community? The applicant hasn't really identified that. How does it benefit all the other neighborhood design business districts, really? Because it provides the commission with the opportunity to hear special permits for housing on the first floor. I don't view that, and that hasn't been identified with any sort of a planning study or planning function on how that'll benefit Fairfield. It destroys consistency in these commercial districts by, once again, allowing residential uses to come into these very limited commercial districts. There are, and once again, the other issue is there are a lot of characteristics in the neighborhood design business district in terms of your requirements in section 12 in terms of how they can be developed. For example, they only require 20 feet of frontage. There's no minimum size for a lot in a neighborhood design business district. There's no minimum shape for a lot in a neighborhood design business district. There is the 3-story height limitation, but you can have 75% lot coverage, which once again might create a situation where someone might say, yes, I'll just put 2 buildings on my lot, or I'll separate the building that exists and I'll have 2 buildings. I mean, that's a possible outcome. There's only a 10-foot street line setback. The sideline setbacks are only 0 and 10 feet. So you may be setting up the perfect storm. Now, there's another interesting issue, and this kind of gets into sort of a legal area, is there is the notion, the regulations are adopted by towns and cities, municipalities in Connecticut by virtue of section 8-2 of the Connecticut General Statutes, which sets forth a series of standards on what this commission and what all commissions should consider in adopting regulations. And so few of them have been addressed by the applicant. And in amending regulations, you have to consider the same thing. But one of the major principles that you should consider is the notion of uniformity of regulations. And we would argue that this produces a uniformity issue in that owners with one property are being treated differently than owners with two properties. I'm sorry, with two buildings on a property or on a lot, as we define it in our zoning regulations. So, for example, if you have two buildings on your lot, you have the ability to have ground floor residential, whereas if you only have one building, you are denied that issue. And it presents an interesting and a very technical situation where, for example, the lot owned by the Hull House Group has two separate buildings on it. If you were to pass a regulation like this, then arguably, one of those buildings could be entirely residential and the other building could be entirely commercial, as long as 50.1% of the building area was commercial. And I don't know if those buildings are identical in size, but let's assume that one is slightly smaller than the other. And one of them becomes entirely residential and the other one becomes entirely commercial. Now, as Attorney Rizzio conceded when he was speaking, the parking regulations for residential are much lower than the parking regulations for commercial. So arguably, you have a situation where, based upon all the parameters that I had identified on size, setback, height, and all that sort of thing, arguably, the lot could be divided. Let's assume that the lot could be sold and divided into two lots. You would have a nonconformity created by virtue of the fact that the ownership is not common to both of those parcels. So in other words, it exists as one lot now with two buildings, and one could be entirely residential and entirely commercial. And you could divide the property, and you could not sell half of the property that has one building on it because the ownership is not the same. And there is this notion in the law that you can regulate uses, but you cannot regulate ownership. And while I've not completely researched this, there is, for example, Tondro in Connecticut says zoning power may only be used to regulate the use, not the user or owner of land. And that's in the regulation. And there is a case, Lord Family of Windsor versus Planning and Zoning Commission, at 288 Connecticut 730, which is a 2008 case, where the Supreme Court says, it is clear, therefore, that the application of the regulation is predicated on the character of the land's ownership, not on its proposed use. It is well established that the zoning power can only be exercised only to regulate land use and is not concerned with ownership. And this contemplates this issue where you have two buildings on a lot versus one building, and it invokes issues of ownership and separates sort of the applicability of the zoning regulations based on the ownership of portions of the property. So that creates an interesting quandary. We would suggest, there's another issue that I could not even begin to get involved with, and that's where a lot is subject or dedicated to a common interest ownership situation like a condominium, in terms of what constitutes property, what constitutes lots, what constitutes units, and that may come into play, and that's not something that's obviously been explored in terms of the applicability of this regulation. And once again, there is this planning notion, and you know, often folks will come to you because they are motivated by a problem that specifically affects their property. And that is what's motivating this applicant, is they have their property on Hillside that they want to develop in a different way. And they come forward with regulations, but on your side of this discussion, there is this larger planning function that you have to consider in terms of the greater good, the greater planning function for the town, and what works and what's workable in terms of the regulations. And the applicant really hasn't answered that. There is obviously a synergy created by having these village districts, that by having an array of commercial uses of shops. You can look at an area like Southport Village. You can look at an area like Greenfield Hill at the bottom of the hill. You can look at Stratfield. And there is something to that, having that little concentrated village. And I would suggest to you that it is unreasonable to suggest that in that area you would put in the middle of any one of, for example, those areas, and I'm not excluding the others, but as I think about it, in those areas, putting a residential use on the ground floor in any one of those areas simply doesn't make sense. And also the discussion about that then we'd have to go get a variance, well, that's a whole nother body of law. And what happens before the ZBA is no reason for you to alter the way that you plan, the way that you adopt regulations, and what you do with those regulations. And I don't think you should be concerned with whether this applicant or any applicant can get a variance or not in deciding how you're going to cast your regulations or amend your regulations. If you'll bear with me for one moment, I'm just taking a lot of notes. So once again, I don't believe, and the applicant has not demonstrated that this benefits the overall community. It destroys consistency and coherence in these neighborhood design business districts. It runs afoul of the uniformity provisions of the Connecticut General Statutes. It treats property owners differently based upon the number of buildings on their properties. It certainly grants benefits to owners with multiple buildings. It may even be interpreted to be varying the zoning regulations for the benefit of certain property owners. And once again, we get involved with that uniformity argument. And I would just urge the commission in the exercise of your jurisdiction pursuant to section 8-2 that this does not begin to meet the standards required for the enactment of zoning regulations or the amendment of zoning regulations. I don't know if you have any questions for me, but once again, where I began this, the applicant is clearly asking you to rewrite your regulations. They are asking for a lot. They're asking to open the door to a special permit situation, which this commission has never considered in the past in this context with neighborhood design business districts. There is this notion that everyone should be able to, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to use up too much oxygen in this room, but there is this notion also that the more definitive your regulations are, and the more defined in terms of rights and what you can do, those are better regulations generally. And it's when we get involved with this notion of opening up more uses, you're not giving up anything. Well, you are giving up things when you open something up to a special permit use. And I urge you not to do that in this instance. I don't know if you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Thank you.
Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak?
Good evening. Good evening. Larry Foley. I'm the applicant. I just want to give you a little history on...
Sorry, could you state your name?
Larry Foley.
Oh, okay.
Foley. Good evening. So the history of the property, I bought about 15 years ago, and I'm not changing the character of the property. It was there, built probably in the 70s, and they're two roughly 4,400 square foot buildings. And quite honestly, I've been here in town for 22 years, and I was surprised the buildings were ever even allowed to be built and put there. So the character of the neighborhood or the village preceded me. And when I bought the buildings, they were in disrepair and pretty much hodgepodge of vacancies and done over. So I moved in, restored both buildings, and I reside in one of the buildings with my business. Subsequently to that, at the point of the little development there's a market that was in total disrepair that I bought, and I actually, somewhat as a gift, somewhat to the community, to restore it, because it was the gateway into Greenfield Hill, and it was, I had a local architect, Franzen, do it, and I think it's been a pretty much of a plus to the neighborhood. There was another building on Hillside that Ann Smith owned. It was, again, in total disrepair, and I bought it and redid it. So I had a tenant in this one building, and both buildings are exactly the same size, and had it on the market for a couple of years to no avail. And some people suggested, and I've actually had discussions with people in local government here, say, listen, maybe a little change of mixed use or whatever, to get some chemistry going into the place. I have no ambition to change the character of what was already there. The building looks exactly the same. My intentions are to build quite nice apartment buildings, something that you would see down in Southport Green. And that was it. I own 40 acres of open land that I've bought over the last 10 years because they were for sale, and tried to keep it open land, and it's sitting there now. So I have my best interest. I own 3 houses in town that I keep in good property, or good repair. So there is no ulterior motive here other than not to leave properties vacant. And people now want to have places they can live in their old community and not have to leave. And up in Greenfield Hill, there is really no place for anybody that sells their house, widowed, divorced, or whatever, or young professional, to live. I'm not looking to make a frat house. It's not going to be, low-income housing. It's going to be high-end. So that's my all intention. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the gas station that's there. That's right across from one of my properties that I put a lot of money into, and now it's sitting there in total disrepair. And I would buy it. But if I buy it and I can't do anything with it, then how do you keep a neighborhood thriving if you don't have people who live in the neighborhood, care, and want to invest back in? I have the capital. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do it. It's not economically home run for me. But I have 5 young children. They've all been born up here. They're all going to stay here. I'm going to stay here. And I want to keep Greenfield Hill, which, quite honestly, there's got to be 100 homes for sale. And I'm just doing my little part, because I can, to keep that little area together. You talk about the ambiance of it. I created most of the ambiance to keep it. Otherwise, the market would be gone. My buildings would be empty, because they're kind of like fish nor fowl. They're 4,400 square feet. What do you put in there? People want to be closer to the train. They want to be where the action is. It's kind of up in no man's land. So I'm not really saying it's a I don't have a hardship. It's not going to make or break me. But I would like to do other things for the community. And the gas station is one of them. And I really would expect, hopefully, you guys go up there and look at it. It is in total disrepair. It's an eyesore. And everybody comes up to me and says, when are you going to buy it? When are you going to buy it? Well, I would like to buy it. But I have to get a little cooperation. I'm not looking for special favors. I have not changed the footprint. Both buildings are equal. People have complained about more noise. Well, I actually think the residents would create less traffic than a building that probably, at full max, could probably hold 40 people. The bank that's on the corner there, I just went by it tonight, creates much more of a neon light in the back to one of my neighbors that's not happy with it. Now, these buildings were there before me. I did not build them. I just inherited a situation which I thought was, I live up the street, I have my office there, great place to work. So I don't want to take any more of your time. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. But that's kind of the history behind what my motives are. I own 4 of those buildings, and the 2 in the middle that I don't own, I probably would own and restore over time. I have no interest in tearing them down and doing something that's fancy like Southport Green. I want to keep the same ambiance. So thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public? Mr. Rizzio?
First of all, under Section 8.2, you are the legislative body with regard to these regulations. You have the right to decide whether you want to improve the regulations, amend the regulations, delete regulations. We have the right to propose them. You have the right to alter them. I think Mr. Joel, with hope, I think he's probably one of the most knowledgeable lawyers. He would know that I think he's been disingenuous with regard to the ability to combine lots and then separate them and sell them out when they would be non-conforming. I think Mr. Wendt would let you know that if you had a piece of property that had 2 buildings on it, those 2 buildings had a requirement that they be 50% commercial, 50% residential. You could not then subdivide those buildings and treat them as separate individual lots. You cannot, in creating a subdivision, you cannot create or exacerbate a nonconformity. And that's what you would do. You would take one lot that is conforming with your regs and create 2 non-conforming lots. I think all of you have been through subdivisions, and all of you who are at staff would know, I can tell you, I know that this staff would not sign any subdivision map that would create nonconformity with your regulations. Look, your regulations are written at a time and in a place. I think there's probably 15 pages of amendments to these regulations, and those amendments aren't done just because a guy on a whim wants to do something. And one thing I think Mr. Green sometimes confuses is there's progress and and staying in place. And I think what we're trying to do is something that's progress. Your regulations are flexible in that you can change them. You don't have to wait once every 10 years for a new book to be rewritten. As times, as uses, as characteristics change, you have the ability to alter your regulations to allow people in your town to progress. If you want to stay in place and you want to keep non-conforming properties, or not allow people the ability to create more conforming properties or adapt to the times, you just never change your regulations. Well, that's not what you have the ability to change these regulations. You have the ability to say, you know what? Sounds like a good idea. You can bring it before me, and if you meet all our regulations and we like it and it fits the neighborhood, we'll approve it. But if not, we'll deny it. But you don't be constrained by a regulation that was written probably 20 years ago. The world has changed so much in 20 years. Office demand has changed. Retail has completely changed. The types of uses, the way things evolve. So we think these regulations, we're within the spirit of the regulations, within the spirit of your master plan, because these districts call for mixed use. You can define how the mix is broken up, either by percentages. You can decide by the way buildings are structured, And then you can give the people also the flexibility to come before you with the same spirit that we want to see a 50-50 split. We want to see half commercial, half residential. But in some instances, maybe they get along in separate buildings. You've passed projects where they've gotten along in separate buildings. That's what this is about. And I don't, throughout the special permit process, if things don't make sense, you have the ability to deny. In the instance of the property, by way of example, not by way of, this is an application for a specific property, office buildings. You have a lot more, in Fairfield now, what you'll see is a lot more back office, which means I know on One Post Road, we used to have 8 by 10, 12 by 14 offices and a secretary outside. You now have cubicles, and they're jamming more people into more space than they ever have. And flexibility for that. So you don't have a building that was built with 3 parking spaces per 1,000 is a dinosaur. So what is an alternate to reuse it so that you can still keep your spirit of your regulations by maintaining the 50% commercial? But let residential thrive there also, but not overpower the property. We're not looking to change their character. We're looking to have the ability to come before you to say that in certain circumstances where there's non-conforming properties, where there's properties that can use, I don't want to say the word relief, but be improved by having these uses in separate buildings, you would have the ability to come before you. We're not asking you, you're not rubber stamping anything, you're not giving us anything more than the ability to come before you as certain circumstances make sense, where there's multiple buildings on the property. We would have the ability to come back before you and request an application to see if this commission thinks it makes sense and it satisfies your regulations. You can see when you think about, and hopefully if you close this hearing tonight and you drive through these neighborhood design districts, and you're going to say, man, these are things I never would have approved if they came before me today. I would have figured out a way to somehow maybe combine these properties so that we limited the curb cuts, that we gave them better parking. Maybe we put residential on one side, or you don't want to restrict yourself. What Attorney Green is asking you to do is say, let's not think out of the box. Let's not give anybody the ability to think out of the box. You either fit this regulation or your buildings stay stagnant. They die. They don't get a chance to thrive with the times. But nothing in this regulation forces you to approve anything. So I hope you understand where we're coming from. We have a very dynamic situation. These neighborhood design districts are the perfect spot where they need work. They need to be safe. They've gone from quaint. You got to remember, when these were designed and they were quaint and they became neighborhood design districts, you had nowhere near the traffic. You didn't have Lincoln Navigators pulling into spots that are 7 feet wide and 12 feet deep that hang over the sidewalks. So we believe we're giving you a tool, not a requirement, to allow us to improve our property and improve other properties in this neighborhood design district. So I ask you, when you look about and you go through these neighborhood design districts, yeah, they're quaint. Can they be improved? They can be improved. We believe this is something that would give you a tool to reduce nonconformities, create similarity of uses, create compatibility uses, allow for better traffic, health and safety, and basically intensity of use, and more clarification as to a master plan with something that's safe. And quaint doesn't have to be, can still be quaint, it still has to meet all of your architectural guidelines and everything else, but it can still be safe and still be rational and still be designed properly. That's really that's what we're asking for. Just the opportunity to improve properties where we're given a chance, not taking away any of your powers. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I believe you have the authority under 8-2 to amend your regulations. There's about 5 pages of amendments that show that you've had the authority to do it over the time. This is not site specific, and I think as you take that map, hopefully over the few weeks while you're deciding this application, and look around saying, you know, there's instances where maybe people can take advantage of a regulation that we could propose, and if it doesn't work, we wouldn't approve it. But this is important. And I think the property our client owns highlights it, but I think as you go around in the area and say the possibilities, keeping your acquaintance, keeping things designed under your in the architectural guidelines, and not having, for example, if you had 5 properties in a row, how nice would it be to have the same properties but one curb cut and have the parking behind the streets in a safe manner that you guys would control the design? Maybe one of the buildings would be residential, maybe the middle would be a nice commercial, but all that stuff is going to be stuff you would design at a public hearing. It would have to make sense. You can't do any of that now. We believe that sometimes multiple buildings need some relief, and we believe that as long as we keep the spirit of true mixed use, which these residence districts are, we're not looking to change the balance from 50-50. We're just want to be more creative in our box. And we would, if the commission thinks any of the language is not as clear, we would be happy to change property to lot. You certainly have the ability to have Emmeline, Jim, and Matt, and your staff look at language to make sure that it meets with the balance of your regulations. That's our stab at, we think it's a better regulation. You have the ultimate authority in deciding what the language is. For all those reasons, we respectfully request you grant this application.
Yeah,
If I may. I have one comment, further reading this. So in the proposed amendment, the section where you say, toward the second half, in the event of a property, or let's say lot, right? In the event a lot contains multiple buildings, at least one of the buildings must have a ground floor that does not contain a residential use. So the emphasis seems to be in the neighborhood design district in that wording to be more on the residential side than the commercial side. And I think the idea is to have, you know, businesses on the ground floor, as we've been talking about. So I would would you be open to perhaps having it, like, is there some way we can get a balance on that where it's like no more than 50% of the first floors can be residential, or my first pass at it was to say only one, at least, I'm sorry, let me back up. It would be to say, in the event of property, a lot contains multiple buildings, only one of the buildings may have a residential use. Something along those lines, but I don't want to be even that restrictive. But
Yeah.
this seems to be restrictive on the other side to say, hey, you only have to have one commercial, but if you have 5 buildings on a lot, and I'm not even talking about, you know, the applicant's specific case. I'm wondering what's going to happen down the road that we're not seeing in these 10 maps you gave us. Is there somewhere where suddenly we could be surprised with multiple buildings, and we now have 6 apartments on the first floor of 5, excuse me, let's say it's 5 buildings, you have 4 apartments on the first floor and 1 commercial. And that's not the intent of this. The intent is to have that stuff on the ground floor so people can pull up in their cars. And I think there's some serious rewording that needs to be done on this for me to approve.
We want you to be comfortable with the word. Yeah. And obviously, the concept, I think, is what I think we're getting through tonight. What we were trying to say was, if there's multiple buildings, we're not looking to turn these into all residential buildings. Clearly, at least to keep, if you have multiple buildings, at least one of the building has to contain a first floor that is non-residential. The commission has the ability, which means that you can't waive that. So I can't come before you next month and say, you know what, I want all my buildings to have residential first floor. We're keeping at least one of the buildings, whatever, how many they are, have to be first floor commercial. If the commission wants to say that if there's multiple buildings, at least 50% of the buildings must have a first floor that's commercial, that's fine too. We're just trying to say we want the ability sometimes, the ability to segregate these uses on a particular lot. We believe it works. We believe it works in town. This commission has seen it. This commission has approved it. But in other districts, but with the same requirement. Those other districts all had a requirement of first floor, non-residential. And they've come through with very successful projects before you that you've approved that has had first floor residential and segregated buildings, but on the same piece of property. So you have the ability, I can't tell you, you have the ability to toy with that language as much as you like. But our idea is we want the ability in instances where there's multiple buildings that one of the buildings be able to have residential on the first floor. We're not looking to change the balance and not looking to reduce the mixed-use component that these regulations require. And keep in mind, in the neighborhood design district, they also have much more restrictive in height, they're restrictive in floors, they're restricted kind of in size. So you're not gonna have any soaring structure. But all of that is gonna be something that's gonna play out and something you would have to adopt if we came back before you with a special permit. We just want the ability to be able, when we shake up our puzzle, to put together the puzzle that in a way that makes the most sense, yet keeps the mixed-use component on the site. That's it. And only in these neighborhood design districts. So when you drive around, they're quaint, but take a look at a lot of them and you'll find a lot of these things could use improvement. And in some ways, the only way these lots could be improved is by consolidation. But don't in any way think that you can consolidate them, split them, and then end up with an apartment building on one lot. You cannot subdivide a conforming lot into two non-conformities. So that to me is clear. We think we satisfy all the requirements in our text amendment. You have all the power under 8-2 to adopt an amendment to this regulation. And we thank you for your time and really appreciate your consideration and the thoughtful inquiries that you made tonight. And I hope we've given you the tools and some things to think about that would allow us to progress and use this regulation to move the town forward, not to keep it in a stagnant state. Thank you.
Thank you. So that ends the public hearing and tonight's meeting.